Good evening and welcome on into Capitol Tonight. I'm Tim Boehm. It's the final day of 2021 and what a year it's been in North Carolina politics. And boy, we got a big one ahead too, right? Down on Jones Street, we got our first state budget in years. We have new congressional legislative maps, although it remains to be seen if those maps will even be used in elections. And speaking of elections, we got a big one coming up in 2022 as North Carolina will decide who replaces the retiring Senator Richard Burr in the upper chamber of Congress. Oh, we're also still dealing with COVID-19 as case numbers are spiking across the country and of course right here in North Carolina. So as we close out the year, we'll take a look back and what is ahead. For more on all this, we welcome on a panel of experts and friends of the show. Dr. Susan Roberts, a political science professor at Davidson College. Dr. Michael Bitzer is a professor of politics and history at Catawba College. Alfredo Rodriguez is the founder and president of Dice Communications, Republican political consulting firm based in Charlotte, and Matt Hughes is a Hillsborough Town Commissioner, member of the Democratic National Committee. Thanks for joining us, all of you. We appreciate you being with us. What a year it was. Dr. Roberts, I'll give you a great one to start off. Just 30 seconds, wrap up 2021. What stood out to you?
Culture wars. And I think we see that played out everywhere. Of course, people would say January 6th, but I think the fact there's such deep division in the country, and that really permeates everything. COVID, distrust in government, the direction of the country. And there are lots of facts and figures, but I think it's just not, it's really necessary to know that this is 2021 and it's going to be 2022 as well. I'm sorry to say.
Dr. Bitzer, how about you, sir?
I'd have to agree with everything my colleague said. You know, the polarization has become so intensified, even more so than we expected post 2016, now into 2020. Everything has become literally infected by partisanship. And I think the dynamic of what we're going to see in a highly competitive election year to determine the fate of what the Biden agenda is going to be like. We know that the president's party tends to lose seats in Congress in midterm elections, but the fight is much more about what the country is, where the country is going, and who makes up the country. So I think the intensity of what Susan articulated in terms of the culture war really broadens out into what are we as a democratic republic, small d, small r? And I think that question will be with us for some time.
Which is interesting because it's a philosophical debate almost more than it is a policy debate. How that plays out, we'll have to see. I mean, Alfredo, what do you think about what they just said? I mean, you're someone that focuses a lot on issues, but will this be part of campaigns that you work on next year too, sort of this larger philosophical question?
Absolutely, and I would agree with all my colleagues here on the panel that, you know, certainly culture wars have played a large role in 2021. From a political standpoint, you know, I would say that the middle has narrowed even more narrowly than it is in typical election years that we're going to see in 2022. I think Republicans and Democrats have dug their heels in. There's a line in the sand, and you know, I don't see much compromise going into the elections with regards to you know, Republicans splitting the ticket or Democrats splitting the ticket. I think the middle has narrowed, and you know, candidates are going to have to speak to a narrow few, you know, maybe 4 or 5% of the electorate that will end up deciding the election come in the primaries with Republicans and Democrats, and also in the general election between Republicans versus Democrats.
So Matt, same question to you, but also, you know, you're on the local level of politics too. I mean, is it infiltrating that where we typically have not seen that partisanship quite as much?
I mean, I agree with Alfredo, and I would say, you know, also, yeah, I think it is permeating down to the local level. I mean, I've seen it in local elections where the biggest determining factor, without knowing, you know, what's your views on wastewater or you know, stormwater retention or anything like that, is, you know, what party are you affiliated with? And I see it in my community. I see it in communities across the country, or not across the country, across the state, where, you know, before they decide to, and I've had it asked of me, you know, are you a Democrat or Republican? And if the answer is the wrong answer, then, you know, I'm not going to get their vote. They do not want to hear anything beyond that. And so I think next year is going to be, you know, like Alfredo said, a very small, persuadable middle. And the rest is just going to be turnout for members of both parties. You know, which party can turn out and mobilize its voters more than the other side, and maybe bring along some persuadable or more moderate voters along with them.
Well, that is interesting. I mean, all four of you agree, which is, good, right? But Dr. Roberts, one of the interesting things about 2021 was that there was a state budget signed for the first time in 3.5 years. Woo, we should celebrate the bipartisanship. But a lot of it was because there was just so much money available, right? I mean, do we take any solace in the fact that they did get this done in a manner where they were able to make it happen?
Well, I think we can take solace in that fact. And I think if you look at some other facts that are around that, North Carolina has not passed, to the best of my knowledge, the same kind of restrictive legislation in terms of access to abortion, in terms of voting rights. And so it may be, although, Michael can talk about redistricting, it may be that there's not the deep divide that's really infecting all these other cities and states across the country. I think that you can take solace in that. And I think that does represent some kind of, recognition that education is important, infrastructure is important. And those are things that it's good to find something that Democrats and Republicans can agree on philosophically and practically.
Dr. Bitzer, before we go to break here, I mean, is that just a moment in time, though? And now we're going to election year. I mean, I can't imagine we have a lot more of these kumbaya moments heading into 2022.
I wouldn't necessarily describe it as kumbaya. I would say it's a welcome truce between the General Assembly and the governor in terms of trying to get things done. I think that there's been a slow thawing of relationships between the two branches of government. But remember, we're going to be heading into an open seat election in 2024 for the governor's race. If these maps, and that's a big if they hold, there is the potential for supermajorities in the legislature to override a governor's veto. So really, North Carolina is unique in that we have divided government, where we've seen these kinds of restrictive and measures and policies have been adopted in unified party government. So this is going to be an interesting case study to see how this dynamic plays out, not just in 2022, but beyond, I think.
And a lot of that will depend on the maps that we will see. Lawsuit on that coming next week, so we will see what happens. Alfredo, let's start with you. Redistricting next week, a lawsuit. We really don't know what these maps might look like. I'm still not convinced we'll see a primary May 17th based on what might happen after that. But all that said, how much is this throwing a wrench in your world of trying to figure out who's going to run and run where and raising money and doing all that? Is this creating a huge challenge?
Well, it's certainly a great uncertainty as to what the lines are going to look like, where individual candidates are going to run.
Alfredo, we lost your audio there on our end here for a minute, so we'll hold off on you. Matt, same question to you. How much is this throwing a wrench in sort of all the planning and trying to figure this out?
I mean, I think it's going to be very hard for candidates to figure out who their constituents are going to be, to know how they're going to run their elections. I mean, for some of these districts, it might be that you have precincts that are moved and you're operating under certain lines, and you're trying to figure out, do I operate under old lines, new lines, some lines to be determined. I think it's really hard for candidates to figure out those things. And then also the voters don't know. They want to know who their candidates are going to be. There's already confusion about, well, this is my district currently, this is my representative. Did that change overnight? And so there's a lot of, I think, voter education that has to be done by the candidates, by voters, and then also just, in a democracy. And it's a lot of uncertainty. And I think it makes people anxious, understandably so.
Alfredo, we'll see if we got you back here. I want to ask you, the court's going to make a decision, and most people think they will overturn them based on the politics of this all. If that is the case, question is then, does it go back to the legislature or does it go to a special master? What do you think about the potential of all that going down?
Well, I want to address the, Democrat argument of fair and 50-50 maps. And, I'll use the, popular Yellowstone series where John Dutton says, fair is what one side decides and the other side can live with. And that's simply what we're going to end up happening here with the North Carolina redistricting. I think the courts will take a look. I do think that the lines will change inevitably. I think particularly in one or two districts in particular. And, we'll see what happens. But, at the end of the day, to the victor go the spoils.
Well, we'll see what happens on that front. All right, 2022 U.S. Senate race. It's obviously going to be the headline. I mean, we do have a 14th district and all that fiasco, but that'll play out for the broad audience, the U.S. Senate race. So, Dr. Roberts, what are you looking for in this race moving ahead? And what do you think about the role of the primary now that the Democratic primary is essentially over?
Sure. I think that is one of the big questions. And I think that Jeff Jackson he kind of took it for the party. And I think that Cheri Beasley is going to have a real advantage with not having to raise all that much money for a primary. Of course you won't. And the Republicans are going to kind of slug it out. For the last 3 elections, North Carolina has been the most expensive Senate race in the country. And I don't see that changing, especially in this seat, in which the last few elections, North Carolina is pivotal with this control of the Senate on the line. I think it's going to be an expensive, depending on who gets the Republican nomination, perhaps a very dirty campaign.
Yeah, and we do know that typically, as you mentioned already, this should be a good year for Republicans based on history about who's in the White House in their first term. But Dr. Bitzer, is there a danger of this McCrory-Budd battle that's already underway and Club for Growth likely breaking that record by themselves? And then sort of, is that a danger for the fall? Or some might argue that that's actually a good thing. You get it all out ahead of time.
Well, certainly primaries tend to test the candidates. They develop thicker skins. They know where the attacks are going to come from generally in the general election. I don't think, as we talked about in the previous segment, I think nationalized political behavior is going to drive so much of what we will see come November. It's again all about do you have a D or do you have an R? And in North Carolina, the dynamic of the swing voter has shrunk considerably over time. And while they're still out there, all midterms tend to be, as all elections are, about turnout. And we will see a decrease in terms of what we saw in 2020 for 2022. But if 2018 was any indication, when we had no major statewide race to speak of, we had 53% of voters turn out. Could we see a new record for midterm electorate turnout if this is an energized electorate and a very competitive election? I would say anything goes.
All right, we only got about a minute left here, but Alfredo, what do you think is the big headline of 2022?
I think the big headline is going to be a big red wave come November. Joe Biden made a lot of promises. He's fallen short on a lot of those promises, whether it be COVID, whether it be the Afghan withdrawal. There's just there's a lot of priorities that Americans have put in front of themselves that Joe Biden has failed on. And I think to pivot off of what Dr. Bitzer said, I think enthusiasm within the parties is what's going to determine turnout. And I think there's a great deal more of enthusiasm with Republicans than there is with Democrats.
All right, Matt, last word to you, and I'm sure you're not going to agree with him, but your biggest headline for 2022.
I mean, I think the biggest headline is going to be that, voters are going to be enthusiastic. I think they are going to be turning out. And, I think that's good for democracy. I mean, we've got to see more energized liberal democracy to be able to have a functioning government. I disagree, of course, with Alfredo. I think it's going to be a hard election. Midterms are hard. But anyone who is in politics or does elections is not in it because it's easy. If it was easy, we'd have, tons of people running in elections all over the place. But it really takes someone with thick skin to get in this game, to want to serve their communities. I think that there's a lot of good promise in the United States Senate for the Democrats to hold the Senate. And we'll see how that shakes out. But I think there's a lot of strong candidates all across the country who are running. And it's clear that the Democrats are not going to be backing down in this election.
Well, as much as anything, we hope everyone has a healthy new year in 2022 after what we've seen. Good to see all 4 of you. Thank you so much. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll take a look at the economy in 2022 with our economists. Stay with us.